Have you ever noticed something strange about how your mind works? You can look at a complicated system and almost instantly see patterns that other people completely miss. You might spot connections in data, notice repeating behaviors in systems, or understand how something works just by observing it for a short time. In fact, when it comes to solving complex problems, your brain often feels very clear and very capable. But then something strange happens. Put that same mind into a social situation, and suddenly things can feel very different. Conversations move quickly, people react in ways that don't seem predictable, and it can feel like everyone else understands the rules of the interaction while you're trying to work them out in real time. So here's the paradox. How can someone be brilliant at seeing patterns in the world, yet still feel lost when it comes to understanding people? At first glance, it can feel like these two things shouldn't exist in the same mind. On one hand, you have the ability to detect patterns, structure, and logic with remarkable clarity. You might see connections in systems, strategies, data, or behaviors that other people overlook entirely. When the environment has clear rules and consistent feedback, your mind can move through it almost effortlessly. But when the situation becomes social, something changes. The same brain that can analyze a complex problem can suddenly feel uncertain when reading facial expressions, interpreting tone of voice, or trying to understand what someone really means in a conversation. Instead of clear patterns, it can feel like you're dealing with signals that shift constantly and don't follow the same rules. Because of this, many people assume something must be wrong. They conclude that if they struggle socially, it must mean their brain is missing some kind of ability. But the truth is much simpler than that. The brain that is excellent at detecting structured patterns is not broken. It's just operating in a completely different kind of environment when it comes to human behavior. To understand this, it helps to look at the difference between two very different types of patterns. The first type is structured patterns. These are the kinds of patterns you find in systems that follow consistent rules. Mathematics works this way, engineering works this way, computer code, mechanical systems, strategy games, and many scientific problems all operate within structures that behave predictably. Once you understand the rules, the system becomes easier to read. The patterns repeat, the signals are clear, and the brain can quickly build a model of how everything fits together. Human behavior is very different. People do not operate according to a fixed set of rules. The signals they send are often subtle, emotional, and constantly changing. A facial expression can mean different things depending on context. Tone of voice can shift the meaning of a sentence completely. Someone might say one thing while feeling something entirely different. So the patterns are not just complex, they are also unstable. A mind that is very good at detecting structured patterns may naturally expect signals to behave consistently. When those signals keep changing depending on emotion, context, and unspoken assumptions, the brain can struggle to build the same clear model that it uses in other areas of life. This is where an important difference in how minds process information starts to appear. Some people naturally prioritize social signals. Their attention is drawn quickly to facial expressions, tone of voice, and subtle emotional cues. They often read these signals almost automatically without needing to analyze them consciously. Other minds are naturally tuned towards system signals instead. These minds pay more attention to structure, logic, cause and effect, and how things fit together as a system. They are very good at spotting patterns, identifying inconsistencies, and understanding how complex pieces interact. Neither style of processing is better or worse. They are simply tuned to detect different types of information first. But when someone whose mind is strongly tuned towards systems is placed into an environment that depends heavily on fast emotional signaling, a kind of mismatch can occur. The brain is still searching for patterns, but the signals it is trying to interpret are constantly shifting and influenced by emotion, context, and unspoken expectations. So the mind that can see patterns everywhere may suddenly feel like it is trying to read a system where the rules keep changing. Up to this point, it might sound like The difficulty comes only from the difference between system patterns and human patterns. But there is another layer that often makes the situation much harder. Social environments can activate emotional threat responses in the brain. When this happens, the brain shifts into what is often called survival mode. The nervous system becomes focused on scanning for danger, protecting itself, and reacting quickly rather than analyzing information calmly. When the brain enters this state, several things change. Clear thinking becomes harder. Processing speed can slow down, attention becomes fragmented, and the ability to read subtle signals becomes much weaker. So the person who normally has excellent pattern recognition can suddenly feel confused or overwhelmed in social situations, not because their intelligence has disappeared, but because the brain has temporarily shifted away from analytical processing and into protection mode. From the outside, it can look like a lack of social ability. But what is really happening is that the brain is reacting to perceived threat, and that reaction interferes with the very abilities that normally work so well. This is also the point where a common misunderstanding appears. When people hear that emotional triggers can interfere with clear thinking, they sometimes assume the goal is to eliminate emotions completely. That isn't the goal at all. Emotions are not the problem. In fact, emotions are one of the brain's most important information systems. They provide signals about what matters, what feels safe, what feels threatening, and how we are responding to the world around us. The problem occurs when certain emotional reactions become triggered automatically, even when the situation doesn't actually require a survival response. When that happens, the brain reacts as if something dangerous is happening, even if the environment is simply a conversation, a social interaction, or a moment of uncertainty. The nervous system tightens, attention shifts, and the ability to process information clearly begins to drop. So the goal is not to remove emotions. The goal is to reduce the unnecessary triggers that push the brain into protection mode. When those triggers are reduced, something interesting usually happens. Emotional signals remain, but the mind becomes much calmer and clearer while experiencing them. And when the brain is not constantly switching into survival mode, the same pattern recognition abilities that work so well in structured systems can start to operate much more effectively in social environments too. Once these trigger reactions start happening repeatedly, another pattern begins to form. If social situations regularly lead to confusion, overwhelm, or discomfort, the brain gradually starts to expect that experience. It learns to associate conversations, groups, or unfamiliar social environments with stress. When that expectation is in place, the emotional response can begin even before anything difficult has actually happened. The brain anticipates the possibility of confusion or rejection, and the nervous system prepares for it in advance. This creates a feedback loop. The person enters a social situation, the brain anticipates difficulty, a trigger response activates, clear thinking becomes harder, the interaction becomes more difficult, and the brain uses that experience as evidence that social environments are threatening. Over time, this loop can make social pattern detection even harder, not because the mind lacks the ability to understand people, but because the brain keeps shifting into protection mode before the patterns have a chance to become clear. You might want to take a moment and think about your own experience. Have you noticed situations where your mind can see patterns in systems almost immediately, yet social interactions still feel confusing or unpredictable? Maybe you can analyze a complex problem with ease, but when conversations move quickly or emotions enter the picture, the signals suddenly feel much harder to interpret. If that sounds familiar, you're not alone. Many people with strong pattern recognition abilities notice the same contrast between how clearly their mind works in structured environments and how different it can feel in social ones. If you've experienced this paradox in your own life, I'd be interested to hear about it. What kinds of patterns do you find easiest to see? And in what situations do social signals feel the most difficult to read? You can share your experience in the comments below. So, the real question becomes this. If the mind is capable of understanding these patterns, why don't things automatically change once we recognize what is happening? Many people reach a point where they understand their reactions logically. They can see the patterns. They know why certain situations trigger stress or confusion, and yet the reactions still happen automatically. This leads to an even deeper paradox. Why does understanding emotional reactions not actually stop them from happening? The answer lies in how emotional triggers are stored and activated in the brain. These reactions are not controlled only by conscious thinking. They are often driven by deeper emotional memory systems that operate automatically. If you'd like to understand how that mechanism works, I've included a link to a short video in the description box below that explains it step by step. And if you're interested in exploring another paradox like the one we discussed today, you can also check out the next video appearing on the screen now.